Welcome back. Conversations, episode 8. Becks coming at you with another solo effort here. Thanks for joining us, whether you're a first-time listener or a long-time listener. I appreciate it either way. You can get us on all of the major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. If there's something that you would prefer to listen to us on, give me a shout. We can definitely take care of that. We're on all the socials, Facebook, X, at @kbecks_ATC. We're also on Instagram, at cornversationspod. And of course, the easiest way to reach us directly would be an email, cornversationspod@gmail.com. In the past episodes, we've been bouncing around a little bit. It's been maybe a little bit difficult to follow. I'll be honest. It's been something that I've tried to figure out a way to keep you guys interested, keep you guys coming back while not necessarily hitting the same topics every week. But this week, I am excited because we're going to kind of revert from that, and we're going to go totally on one topic. It is, of course, college football. We have passed the midpoint in the regular season already. 7 weeks down, 7 to go before we get into conference titles and, of course, the college football playoff and bowl season. So wanted to take a moment this week to cover what we've seen so far in college football and what I expect to see moving forward. We're going to kind of bounce around today, look at the entirety of the landscape, a little whip-around coverage, looking at all of the conferences and focusing on the G5 as a whole. We'll look at where I was right, where I was wrong with some of my preseason predictions that you can go back and look at and make fun of me for on Around the Corn Sports blog. But even if you don't want to do that, I think it'll be fairly apparent where I messed up or didn't really get it right so far, and where I've had to shift moving forward. But we're also going to go ahead and re-rack the college football playoff predictions that I made as part of the first episode of Conversations as well. So hopefully this episode will prompt a lot of questions. I'll try to hit the topics that'll be the softballs, so make you guys think a little bit when you submit your questions. Hopefully we can get some intriguing, engaging topics in future episodes based on what we've seen so far throughout the season. But we'll go ahead and we'll kick it off with what we're seeing out of the G5 conferences this year. And this is one where I was definitely wrong from the get-go. If you recall, during episode 1, I had predicted that Boise State would be able to run it back and would be the G5's automatic berth to the college football playoff this season. That became apparent pretty quickly, week 1, that it was going to be tough for the Broncos to repeat that effort. They were trounced by USF on the road. But what we did find out from that game was that USF is actually a pretty good team this year, and they've managed to keep that momentum going for the most part, and they are definitely in the thick of the playoff conversation at this point in the season. In fact, you could argue that really most of the focus in terms of the G5 conferences this year really has to be on the American Conference as a whole, because the best teams and the ones that are most likely to make the playoff this year are all situated in that conference. You've, of course, got the Bulls. They're a good team. They've proven that they can hang with power conference competition, going down and beating Florida on the road in the swamp, a thing that some other big-name teams have failed to do this season. And the one loss they have is to a team in Miami that I think most people at this point believe in. There's not a ton of questions being asked of Miami right now, and frankly speaking, they may not get a lot of questions moving forward until we get into the later part of the season. But the Bulls are definitely in there. I've really liked what Byron Brown has been able to do this season. He's a guy who has always been on the radar as a potential impact player in college football, but he's struggled in past seasons keeping himself healthy and on the field. But this season, he's been fortunate to not have those issues, and it's been a really difficult thing for opposing defenses to stop. He's a freight train. I think one of the broadcasts that I listened to earlier this year that the Bulls were on, the announcer compared Brown to a fullback that just so happens to be able to throw the ball well enough to be a quarterback. And I think that's a pretty good explanation of what Brown is as an offensive playmaker. But joining them in the fight for the college football playoff are a few other teams out of their conference, and one of them that's, I think, possibly the favorite to make it into the college football playoff this year is the Memphis Tigers. They're a team that was on the radar this year as one that could break into that playoff grouping this season. I did not choose them to make it. I actually did choose them to make it to the American Conference title game this season, but then I got a little bit cheeky and chose UTSA to beat the Tigers in that conference title game. Right now, that's not looking like that's going to be the pairing in the conference title game, but in addition, the Tigers have essentially passed all of the challenges that they've been presented with so far. I think the game for me that sold me on the Tigers being a team that is for real is what they were able to do on the road against Arkansas earlier in the season. Say what you will about the Razorbacks and what they were under Sam Pittman, but they're not a bad team offensively, and Memphis was struggling against that in the first half, but shut things down in the second half, and that furious comeback against the Razorbacks is really kind of the feather in the cap right now for Memphis. But that could change, and it will have to change, really, for Memphis to continue to be in the conversation for the playoff, because you've got a game coming up next week, week 9, between Memphis and USF that I think may decide who is really the front runner for that playoff spot out of the G5 conferences. And the reason I think Memphis could be the favorite there, if you look at their schedule, they've got some tough games left. They've got South Florida, they've got Tulane a couple of weeks later, and then to end the season, they've got a game against Navy that may not look all that impressive when you look at it on paper at that point in the season, because the Midshipmen, despite being undefeated right now, have some tough games themselves coming up. So there may be a couple of losses on the schedule by that point for the Academy, but in terms of what that team actually is, that's a good win if Memphis is able to get it. It's also going to be a revenge game for the Tigers because Navy was able to beat Memphis last season, and that game was essentially the nail in the coffin for the Tigers last year when they were also a team looking to potentially break into the playoffs. So those are 3 games that Memphis has in the schedule that are going to probably be overlooked by the national media and the general college football fan. But in terms of what those actually mean, they're crucial to Memphis's case, and they really are going to be good victories if they can get all 3 of them. And the reason I think they're in a good spot is because they're at home for all 3 of those games. So of the 6 games that Memphis has left on the regular season schedule, 3 of them that are their most difficult are home games, and I think that sets up the Tigers really well. They're a different team this year. They don't have a guy that is, a traditional drop-back passer at quarterback. They're far more predicated on the run this year. But Brendan Lewis has stepped in very nicely for the departed Seth Hennigan, and he's got some good wheels. And he's got a running back mate in Sutton Smith, who's one of the best in the American Conference. So I like this team on paper. I like this team from what I've seen from them in action. And I think that along with USF, potentially Navy, and you got to throw Tulane in there as well, you've got a really good conference in the American that is worth watching. Circle that game next week on week 9 between South Florida and Memphis. I mentioned in my preview of week 7 on Around the Corn Sports blog last week that the South Florida North Texas game was the game of the year so far in the G5 ranks. And at the time it was. But that's going to get replaced by this South Florida Memphis game coming up. That is likely to be a ranked on rank matchup. And you've got 2 really good teams who have already proven themselves this year. So looking forward to seeing what the American is able to do. Just giving a little bit of love to some other teams. UNLV out of the Mountain West does have an outside shot, I think, to still be in the conversation, especially if they can get a win over Boise State this weekend. But that's going to be a tough thing to do. The Broncos, while they're likely out of the playoff discussion at this point, are still a dangerous team in the Mountain West. And I do think against Mountain West competition, Boise State is definitely able to beat anybody that they go up against. They're a different team this year, but they're still trying to do the same things. And against non-Power 4, non-Notre Dame competition, I think Boise State is resembling a team that is a lot closer to what they were last year than they've shown to be when they're playing in the big games. Obviously the USF game did not go the way that they wanted. USF had a great game plan defensively to highlight some of the challenges that Boise State was going to have this season without Ashton Jainty, but Sire Gaines is a good running back, and Maddox Madsen is not a bad quarterback if you put him in position to succeed. And by that, I mean don't get behind the sticks, which is something that they unfortunately dealt with in those USF and Notre Dame losses. So I look at this week's game between Boise State and UNLV as kind of a crucial opportunity for another team from outside of the American Conference to kind of enter the conversation there for the playoff. And if UNLV is unable to get it done, I think you're almost surely looking at a team from the American Conference getting into the playoff this year. You're really not seeing anything else from any of the other conferences. The Sun Belt, James Madison, probably not going to be there. Conference USA doesn't really have anything this year, and in the MAC, as competitive and exciting as it is, you've got the best teams there with 3 losses already. So it is the American Conference's bid to lose, and we'll see what ends up happening for the rest of the season because you've got some good matchups in that conference moving forward. Shifting now to the independents, and we'll focus on this one here for a little bit specifically because Notre Dame is very much so still in the conversation for the playoff. They took a lot of flack, in my opinion, not entirely rightfully so at the beginning of the year by dropping the first 2 games. But when you look at what those teams are now, it's not a bad position to be in at all. I mean, you've got a field goal loss to a team in Miami that's number 2 in the country right now, and you've got a wild 1-point loss to a Texas A&M team that is number 4 in the country right now. So the losses aren't bad for Notre Dame, and it appears over the past few weeks that the Fighting Irish have shored up some of the issues that were paramount in those losses early in the year. Defensively, I was surprised that the Fighting Irish were struggling because that has been the calling card for the Fighting Irish for some time now under Marcus Freeman, and they had enough pieces coming back that you would have thought they would have, at the very least, held their own on the defensive side while maybe the offense came up to speed with CJ Carr. But that wasn't the case, and what we're seeing now over the last 3 weeks, though, is that the defense is starting to catch up with where the offense has been. Looking at the statistics, Notre Dame over the past 3 weeks has been very opportunistic and aggressive defensively. They've got 11 sacks and 7 turnovers in those last 3 games, and they have essentially shut down 3 offenses that all are averaging over 30 points a game. And say what you want about those teams, if you're averaging 30 points a game, you have some level of talent on your offense, and Notre Dame has shut all of them down. So I was ready to hold my tongue on Notre Dame after those first 2 losses. I felt like the ranking that they maintained, even starting 0-2, was justified, and I think we're starting to find out why. But they still have a couple of games left on the schedule that could take them right back out of the playoff race. At this point, there's no room for error for the Fighting Irish, but I do like where they're at right now, and if they take care of business, then they're going to make the playoff this year. So I think it's been a good coaching job by Marcus Freeman to avoid letting this one get out of hand, and it will be very interesting to see what they do this weekend against Southern Cal. It'll be interesting to see what they do against Navy, and then you've got a potential trip-up game there against Pittsburgh late in the season, and Pittsburgh has really been coming on lately since replacing Eli Holstein. So there's definitely some games there that the Fighting Irish could struggle with, but at this point, given what's already happened during the regular season, I think Notre Dame is in a good spot. Moving on to the ACC. This one was a conference that we kind of felt like at the beginning of the season was a 1, maybe 2 team race. At least I did. And I was wrong. This is definitely a conference that I was wrong about. I thought Clemson had the opportunity to run the table this season. I was really high on the Clemson, well, really the offense and the defense. And the offense has looked pretty poor at times. They've sort of cleaned it up a little bit in the last few weeks, but it's hard to tell whether or not that's real or it's partially the competition they've been playing. So the jury is really still out about Clemson as a team, but at this point with 3 losses, I'm not really sure they're in the conversation anyway, especially with the perceived talent and strength of the ACC as a whole. But another area where I was wrong, and this is something that I thought was not going to go their way this season, but they've done very well, and they have proven themselves as one of the better teams in the country, is Miami. Carson Beck has had a renaissance year. It's been nice to see him bounce back after the season that he had last season at Georgia. I do think that he is one of the better quarterbacks in college football, and he's been able to show that with Miami. They've done a great job keeping him protected. They've got a good running game, and it just looks like all of the pieces have come together for Miami. I think this is almost inarguably Mario Cristobal's best team that he's had since he's been at the program, and unless something massive happens in terms of an injury or in terms of just a game that we don't see coming in terms of performance by Miami, I think that as opposed to Clemson waltzing into the ACC title game, you're looking at the Hurricanes doing that. There's argument that Miami may be the best team in the country, and at this point, it's hard to make that determination. I personally don't think that's the case, but they're definitely in the conversation amongst a handful of other teams for the second best team in the country, and I think that there isn't much to separate a lot of those teams. So it's been I suppose you could say that it's been a predictable season in the ACC in that they only have maybe one really good team, but the teams that have emerged are not the teams that I thought would emerge. Joining Miami in the ACC title game at this point is very difficult to tell. I mean, if you look at the standings right now in the ACC, things are pretty bunched up there, and I think it could go a number of ways. Georgia Tech obviously has the win over Clemson that introduced itself to the country, but I think that there's a possibility that one of those other teams right now that's undefeated in the conference along with Miami might end up taking that spot. For me, the biggest surprise is Virginia, and I think they've actually got a really good opportunity to be that team that at least gets a shot at playing the Hurricanes in the ACC title game this year. So moving on to the Big 12. Similarly to the ACC, I feel like this conference has been what we've expected in terms of there not really being a ton of great teams that wow us, but it's a very competitive conference. It's a very unpredictable conference. I think the one area that we could say almost unanimously has been a surprise this season has been how good Texas Tech has been. And I do want to talk about them for a moment because Texas Tech is for real. They're a very good football team. I was not sure about them coming into the year because of the number of pieces that they had effectively bought. I mean, let's call it what it is. They effectively bought this team to come down and play in Lubbock. And there were question marks from my end about how Joey McGuire would be able to assemble this team to actually perform on the field. But they've exceeded all of my expectations, and there were some pundits before the season who saw this coming. So this isn't really out of left field. I was just wrong about it. There were people who were pointing out that Texas Tech had a ton of talent on both sides of the ball. They've got lots of speed at the skill positions. They've got a running game for the first time in, gosh, I don't even know how long. I mean, Texas Tech is not known for their running game, but they've got really good options there. And the thing that I think is most impressive is that there is depth at the program. Baron Morton has gotten himself banged up a couple of times this season, and you would expect at Texas Tech, when you have a guy like that at the quarterback position go down, that there could be a significant drop-off, but that has not been the case. Will Hammond came in relief of Morton and has looked pretty solid himself. It looks like he, if needed, could continue to carry this team, or not really carry, but do what Baron Morton has done as the starter. And that's impressive, I think, for this program, because they've not been one of those programs where you can expect shark's teeth, where if somebody goes down, that you're going to be able to fill that spot pretty quickly. But, that is the power of having the funds to put together a pretty solid team. And this is a program that needs to be taken seriously. I was under the impression that they would get some pretty decent games from some of the other teams in the conference this year, like Utah, for example. And Utah gave them about 2.5 quarters and then basically ran out of gas. And I think that's what Texas Tech is able to do this year, is that they're going to be able to continue the success throughout 60 minutes, whereas some of these other teams in the Big 12 are just a little bit too inconsistent or a little bit deficient in some areas to really challenge what Texas Tech is able to do this year. So good on Texas Tech. I think they're definitely one of the better teams in the country this year. I think the rest of the teams in the Big 12 are kind of settling for second place at this point. But it's going to be an exciting battle because, similarly to the ACC, you've got a number of teams there that are in the conference title race. You've got the Holy War coming up this weekend between BYU and Utah. That's going to be an excellent game, and it's going to give one of those teams a real leg up on being that second team to get into the Big 12 title game. And then let's say, for example, that Utah does win that game, and just giving it away, that is my pick, is that Utah is going to be able to beat BYU this weekend. Then the Utes would have a pretty significant game likely later in the season against Cincinnati, who has also looked like a team capable of vying for that second spot in the Big 12 this year. And UC also has a game against Texas Tech, so there's the opportunity that we could even be surprised by the Bearcats, and they may make things even more interesting than I'm expecting it will be for the second half of the year. So I would keep an eye on the Big 12. I think, like last year, it's going to come down to the final week, and it is worthwhile to see if Texas Tech does get any major resistance from the rest of these teams, because if they don't, I think you're looking at Texas Tech almost like a team like Miami that could be fresh, that could be relatively untested if they were to make it into the college football playoff. And that could be an interesting scenario for both of those schools. So now we're moving on to the big boys. We'll start with the SEC, and there's a reason that I'm starting with the SEC instead of the Big Ten, and that's because in my mind, the SEC has been second in command to the Big Ten this year in terms of, what we're seeing at the very top of the conference. I mentioned in the preseason I thought the SEC was heavy at the top, and I mentioned that the Big Ten was heavy in the middle. And I think you probably could switch those two statements at this point in the season. The SEC, yes, they've got a number of teams who are up there in the top 10 right now. So by no means are they lacking for talented programs. But what I've seen from them so far is that, yes, they're very balanced, but I think the true best teams in the country, if you're comparing the best that the SEC has versus the best that the Big Ten has, I think that there's a very legitimate argument to be made that the Big Ten has been at the top, stronger as a whole than the SEC has been this season. What can we expect for the SEC moving forward? That is the question of the hour. I think that there's so many of these games that could go either way for the last 7 weeks of the season that it's very difficult to tell which ones will make it out of that gauntlet. And it still is a gauntlet. And I think you're going to see a lot of cannibalization as well. I think that you've got teams up there right now like LSU, like Ole Miss, that have shown us some things at times, but we have questions about them. And both of those teams have plenty of opportunities coming up for them to either confirm for us that they are a legitimate national title contender, or they will get taken down by equally capable teams. And we're going to have a lot of, 2, maybe even 3-loss SEC teams where, as usual, we're going to have these discussions at the end of the season comparing a lot of teams in the SEC to maybe some capable, qualified, justified teams from other conferences. And so I don't see it going any differently this year. I think you're going to have a number of teams right there around the 8 to 15 rankings in the college football playoff rankings that are going to be from the SEC. And that's just a result of the cannibalization that we're going to see from this group. So still very balanced. Still a lot of good teams. I think where I've been right was Alabama. I think Alabama has proven themselves as a team that is capable of winning the SEC this season. Ty Simpson has been, if not the best, one of the best college football players throughout the 7 weeks. And he means so much to this team, whereas when you look at some of the other Heisman Trophy candidates at this point, I think that their teams around them are so good and can be trusted that they don't have to do as much as quarterbacks as maybe Ty Simpson does. So I don't want to give away that, because I will go into just briefly what my Heisman Trophy candidates at this point are. But as a little giveaway, I do feel very strongly that Ty Simpson is amongst the best there in that regard. Before we move on to the Big Ten, though, the question for Texas. I mean, are they still a viable team to make the college football playoff? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Maybe I'm a little bit biased here because I felt like they were one of the best teams in the SEC this season, and they have had no shortage of their issues, particularly offensively and primarily at the quarterback position. But in terms of, do they have the ability to still make the playoff if they're able to for example, win the rest of their games, which is a big ask? Yes, of course. The answer is yes. I don't look at the losses to Ohio State and Florida as particularly damaging, especially to a brand like Texas. And I think that what they did against Oklahoma last week suggests that the talent is there. It's just a matter of putting it together on a week in, week out basis that has been a struggle for the Longhorns this season. My thought on the victory over Oklahoma last week is that while it looks good on paper, I think that it is perhaps more a result of what Oklahoma was unable to do offensively than what Texas has become overnight. Because you were looking at a very different Texas team against Oklahoma than we saw the week prior in the Swamp. And the decision for Brent Venables to decide to trot John Mateer out with 1.5 working hands is an indication that Oklahoma probably is not one of those teams that's going to survive that cannibalization that I expect from the SEC this season. So I am a little bit sad to say that I probably won't be able to toot my own horn about calling Oklahoma in the playoff this year. I mean, they're still in the running for it, but if Mateer is not able to go, then I think they've got real problems there offensively. So we'll see how the rest of the season goes for them as well. And last but not least, the Big Ten. I know I've got a lot of listeners in Big Ten country, so they'll be particularly interested in hearing what we've got to say about these teams. As I alluded to just a few minutes ago, I personally think that the Big Ten has been the best conference in college football this season. I think at the top, they are the strongest. I think that they perhaps have the program with the best win when it comes to proving something to us as fans and as analysts that we didn't necessarily know or believe prior to a game. And I think that they've still got a number of teams that could crawl their way back into contention as well. So let me start with the cream of the crop, if you will. I mean, Ohio State, in my opinion, is head and shoulders above the rest of the teams in college football this season. I always expected them to be in the conversation for the playoff, but what I was not prepared for was just how dominant this team was going to be on both sides of the football. And in particular, how dominant they've been on the defensive side of the football. I won't go into too much detail about this because, spoiler, the mailbag question that we have for this week also essentially asks the same question about the Ohio State defense. But what Matt Patricia has been able to do with this group, which did have some question marks coming into the season, is nothing short of incredible. I mean, they have been the best defense in college football this season, and it's been one of the best defenses that we've seen in a long time across college football. And what it allows for is for the offense to essentially play within the game plan that they've set up. And so they're not needing Julian Sayin to be a world beater. Not that he was going to need to be one anyway with the amount of talent they have around him, but the amount of pressure that's been put on Sayin as a first-year starter has been pretty low, quite frankly. And there have been some big spots that they've been put in already. The game against Washington was no joke on the road, and the game last week against Illinois, again, was no joke. That was a game that I actually thought Illinois was going to be able to win before the season started. And at no time during that game did it feel like Ohio State was in a position where they could potentially lose control of that game. So definitely elite status for Ohio State. In terms of the best win that I've seen from any program this year, I think you have to give that to Indiana. And that, of course, is the game that we saw last week against Oregon. I was a hater. I did not think that Kirk Cignetti was going to be able to run it back this season with Indiana. There were some signs. There was some writing on the wall that this could be the case. He went out and he did replace what they lost with transfers and portal guys this year. But I was just not a believer that they were going to be able to do this a second season. I figured it was going to be something where people would start to figure out what was going on and do the necessary things that were required, which teams like Ohio State and Notre Dame were able to do last season. But that has not been the case. Indiana has been excellent on both sides of the ball. They're very aggressive defensively. They put a lot of pressure on opposing quarterbacks, and they force mistakes, which is something that really wasn't happening against the teams they've beaten so far that are considered their best wins, the Illinois game and the Oregon game last week. They forced Luke Altmaier and Dante Moore into mistakes that they were not making prior to playing Indiana. So defensively, I've been impressed, and offensively, I've been really impressed with them as well. I think that they've got excellent wideouts. They have a strong running game. Fernando Mendoza has been great. He's been better than Curtis Rourke was last year, if only because he's healthier than Curtis Rourke was last year. And so I think some of the things that Cignetti maybe wanted to do last year at the quarterback position that he was unable to do, he is able to do now this year with Mendoza, and especially with him being healthy and being able to move around a little bit better. So that's probably the biggest surprise to me in the Big Ten outside of the Penn State situation, which has been a complete disaster. For me, that's coming out of left field, like Notre Dame, like Clemson. I was wrong. I thought Penn State was going to be a force this season, not only in the regular season, but once we got to the playoffs as well. They have been anything but that. It really feels like emotionally the bottom dropped out for that team after the UCLA loss. Maybe you could even argue that it was after the Oregon loss as well, but by no means were they out of things when they lost that game to Oregon. But it's been a little bit sad to watch, honestly, because you're looking at a team that was built to make good on a lot of the expectations that they had for themselves and for a lot of us voicing our thoughts in various places on the internet. I think that there was the thought that they would be able to meet those expectations as well. But on to the next chapter, I suppose you could say, for Penn State, and we'll see. We'll see where that goes. I have my thought on who I think would make the most sense to take over that program. For me, it's Matt Rule, but we'll see what happens. At this point, it's pretty difficult to tell, but they'll figure it out in time, and we'll, of course, talk about that once it has been confirmed. The last thing I want to talk about with the Big Ten, and maybe this is me just hanging on to something that I thought was a possibility this year. What's the outlook for Illinois? The Illini now are sitting at 2 losses. Neither one of them were super competitive for various reasons. I think in the Indiana game, you could chalk that up a little bit to the deficiencies they had in the secondary. And then against Ohio State, frankly speaking, they were just outmatched. But if you look at the rest of the schedule for Illinois through the end of the season, there is a path for the Illini to still make the playoff, or at least be in the playoff conversation. This week's game against Washington is going to be a tough one, and they've got to get by that. But if they're able to, 3 of their last 4 games of the season are at home, and their one road trip is on the road to Madison to take on Wisconsin, who at that point in the season very well may be looking at a different situation than they have currently as far as their head coach is concerned. So I do think that the Illini have a path. I still think that this is a good football program. They are a step below the elite teams in the Big Ten, but if they're able to finish out the rest of the season without any additional losses, I think that they're definitely a team who's going to be right in the same area that they were last year. And as opposed to last season, where we were looking at teams from the SEC, and then you had a team in SMU and the ACC who made it into the conference title game, and they weren't going to kick them out in favor of a team who didn't. That may not happen this year. You may not have an opportunity for somebody to essentially block a 2-loss Illinois team from making it. So I certainly still think that the Illinois possibility of making the playoff is there, but they've got some work to do, and it starts this weekend. So before I dive into my re-rack of the college football playoff, I mentioned that I would give a short synopsis of where I see the Heisman Trophy candidacy at this point, because I know that's a softball question that I would get if I didn't cover it. For me, I've got 3 guys that come to mind. I'll rank them from, in my opinion, the least deserving at this point in the season to the most deserving, and we'll go from there. If you've got some questions about why I didn't include somebody else, or you've got somebody out of left field that you're considering, let me know. Send a mailbag question to us. Would love to keep talking about this topic as things will obviously develop significantly between now and the end of the season. But starting with my number 3 at this point, despite his challenges that he had last weekend, I would still go with Dante Moore. I think he's looked very strong this year. I think Oregon has surprised me with what they're able to do offensively, especially with having to replace as many pieces as they did on the offensive line. Moore is one of the most mature guys at quarterback in college football, and I think that he was instrumental in that victory over Penn State, which doesn't look as impressive now, but at the time it was, and everything is about optics. So for me, going on the road to win in Happy Valley in that environment was a big indication that this is a guy who is truly leading his team and isn't just along for the ride in terms of what they're able to do offensively. So I think if Oregon is able to stick around in the Big Ten title race, probably get into the playoff if they do so, that Moore is going to be a guy that's looked at as a potential Heisman Trophy candidate. For me, number 2 is Fernando Mendoza. And the reason I have him at number 2 is what he was able to do last week. You talk about maturity. I saw a ton of that and a ton of poise from him when he threw the pick 6 against the Ducks, which looked like it might have been a turning point in that game. And in fact, it wasn't the turning point at all that we expected. It ended up being the last points that the Ducks would score in the game. And the ability for Mendoza to shake that off and to just go about his business and make sure that Indiana would continue to move the ball in that game when it looked like the crowd was going to get back into it was really impressive to me. I think he's been a guy who is doing a lot for his offense. Yes, he has a lot of talent around him, but he is still instrumental in what they're able to do. And I think that does go a long way when you look at, okay, what are we giving this award for, right? And it's the best player in college football. It's the most instrumental guy in college football, and he definitely, in my opinion, meets that categorization for the Hoosiers. But number 1, and I kind of already mentioned this a little bit earlier, I've got Ty Simpson. I think he is, to some extent, pulling Alabama along with him. Alabama is not a perfect team by any means. They've got a number of tough games left, but I think that if the Tide are able to make the playoff, and let's say that they are even able to win the SEC title, you're going to look at Ty Simpson's performances, and you're going to have a lot of instances that you can go to and say, yeah, he was the reason they won that game, or yeah, he was the reason that they stuck around in that game, or oh yeah, that was a instrumental, play during this game that he had, and that basically saved Alabama, because this is not a team that is perfect from an offensive or a defensive perspective, and he is doing quite a bit to make sure that they're staying in these games, and he's going to continue to have to do a lot to make sure that Alabama is staying in these games, because their schedule is pretty tough through the rest of the season. So I look at Ty Simpson. I think he is doing the most for one of the better teams in the country, and I think those are the two things that you look at in a normal year where you don't have a Travis Hunter that comes from outside of those playoff or national title contenders. So that's who I've got at this point is Ty Simpson, and we'll see how it ends up shaking out for them. If Alabama loses a couple more games, I think that potentially could shift. But at this point, he's right there in the mix with guys like Mendoza and Dante Moore, and you can throw guys like Jeremiah Smith in there as well. So I'm gonna actually continue to tease the college football playoff re-rack. We're going to go ahead and we're going to hit up the mailbag quickly here before we move into that, because it is related to Big Ten talk. So this one comes from Basie. He says, "Hey, K-Becks, I listened to your inaugural podcast a few weeks ago. You had Illinois beating OSU. Well, let's just say that didn't age well." That is correct. It did not. "Is this the best Buckeye defense the program has ever seen?" Thanks, Basie. I think that's a good question. I think it's one that can be asked, because I think there is debate that yes, it is. I haven't had time to look into the statistics of what you've seen from Ohio State defenses in the past, and so we're kind of going off of memory here of, okay, what are some of the better defenses that we've seen from this program over its history? And for me, the one that comes to mind is the 2002 national title winning team that was buoyed in large part by their defense. And I think if you're comparing this year's defense to that one, there's a lot of things to like about this year's defense that suggests that it might be the best that the Buckeyes have seen in their history. It's a situation where there were a lot of question marks about just how good and how quickly this defense could get up to speed, with Matt Patricia coming in, replacing Jim Knowles, with a number of young guys replacing guys who had departed for the NFL. I don't think there were very many people suggesting that Ohio State would take a huge step back from last season, but to suggest that they would take a massive leap forward, which they have done, by my estimation, is where I think you have to give Patricia and the players a lot of credit. At each level of the defense, they've got a monster. You've got Caden Curry up front, who's really coming into his own as a young player at this point. Arvell Reese in the middle of the defense, who is just a physical freak, and he's going to be a guy who's going to be causing similar types of chaos on Sundays at some point. And then you've got the coach on the field in Caleb Downs, who's been kind of that solidifying force, the guy who's been there, and a guy who somebody like Matt Patricia can rely on to keep these guys grounded, the ones that are, still kind of learning the nuances of the college game. So you've got guys who are either physical or mental leaders at every level. You've got a coach who is capable of doing really impressive things with the talent that he has, and not every defensive coach in college football is going to be able to do that. I mean, it does. It takes a special guy to look at the talent that they've got on Ohio State's defense and actually put forth the performances that they're having. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier in the episode that I think the defense has been so good that it allows the offense not necessarily to coast, but to go about their business, to stick to the game plan that they want to employ, and it's worked out. So I think that you have to let the season play out to come to a conclusion about whether it's the best ever, because lots can happen in the last 7 weeks of the season. But at this point, I think that you could make a strong argument that this is the best defense that Ohio State has had. And that's just the combination of the talent they have as well as what they're actually doing from a statistical standpoint. So good question, Basie. Appreciate it. Hopefully you'll send more mailbag questions in the future. But with all the teasing, I finally have gotten to the point now where I'm going to break down my re-rack of the top 12. So we'll go ahead and we'll do the same thing that we did in the past. We'll go from 12 to 1. I will somewhat quickly go through this because I think at this point I've talked about a lot of these teams earlier in the episode, so there's a reason why they're getting in. It's either that I think they're going to win the conference or that they're going to be in a position to get one of those at-larges based on what they've got coming up for the rest of the season. So at number 12, I've got Memphis. I think that they're going to be the G5 participant this year. Again, that October 25th game against USF is going to be huge in determining this. If Memphis is not able to win that, then I think you probably look at USF and you say, okay, they've got multiple wins this year. People are familiar with them. The voters are familiar with them, which is going to have an impact on what happens because you have to be a conference champion and you have to be the highest ranked conference champion out of the G5 group in order to qualify. So I'm giving the nod to Memphis, but that one could go a number of different ways, likely out of the American Conference. At number 11, I have Utah. And the reason I have Utah here is that I do think that they're going to make the Big 12 title game. Likely, I think they're going to be set up against Texas Tech for a rematch of an earlier game this season. And even if they lose, I think you look at the body of work for Utah, you look at the fact that they would have made a title game, and it would be hard to leave a team out with 2 losses that had only lost one team all season. So if the Utes are able to make the Big 12 title game, I do see them making the playoff, which is something that I had predicted earlier in the year. At number 10, I have Tennessee. This one was tough for me because I looked at the SEC. I look at the number of teams that could make it that I don't think are going to win the conference, and I just kind of had to pick one. And I like what I've seen from Tennessee, especially offensively. I think Joey Aguilar has been excellent this season. I think he's got good wide receivers to throw to. They've obviously got a strong running back by committee core, and as long as they can keep games like the Alabama game that's coming up this weekend close, I think they're going to have an opportunity to stay, from a rankings perspective, in contention for this spot. But you probably could put any one of 3 or 4 SEC teams in this spot that I have Tennessee. So this one, I wouldn't bet on it, but of the teams that I am not going to put in from the SEC a little bit higher, I think they are the one that will get the nod. At number 9, I have Texas A&M. The Aggies have been good this year. I mean, you have to give a lot of credit to Mike Elko. They look balanced on both sides of the football. They have taken care of business. They've got a tough schedule coming up the last 7 weeks of the season, and that's going to be instrumental in what ends up happening with this program. You know, in the past, they haven't really delivered on a lot of talent that they've had within the program. So far, they're doing that. But, you know, you've got games on the road against LSU and Missouri coming up after this week. And then you've got a tough game, a rivalry game at the end of the season against Texas, which is going to be no joke either. So there are a lot of hurdles for Texas A&M here. And that's part of the reason why I actually don't have them higher, because they are the number 4 team in the country right now. But I do think that they're going to be able to get 2 of those games that I mentioned, and I think that'll be enough for the Aggies to be able to slip in. At number 8, I've got Notre Dame. Again, I've been high on them all season, even before the season started. I really have been impressed with C.J. Carr as a quarterback. I think he gives them a lot more flexibility offensively than they had last season, which was, I think, a little bit of a surprise. I think a lot of people thought the loss of Riley Leonard might be an issue for them. But offensively, there have really been no issues for Notre Dame this season. And if Jeremiah Love stays healthy, that is probably going to persist. They've got an interesting injury right now to their center, so they're going to be working with a new guy, and that could be interesting given that Carr is still a young guy at quarterback. So pay close attention this week in the game against Southern Cal to see how the relationship between center and quarterback goes for the Fighting Irish, because oddly, that could have a pretty big impact on what I'm seeing here for the Fighting Irish for the rest of the season. At number 7, I've got Oregon. I think they are going to get in. I think you look at the rest of their schedule. They don't necessarily have to make the Big Ten title game in order to get in. And I think that Dan Lanning is going to have his team ready to go in the biggest games for the rest of the year. Just looking at their schedule, what they have left, there's not really anything there that seems like they can't take care of. The game against USC near the end of November, and then the game against Washington. So basically, a revival of some Pac-12 matchups are going to be the biggest obstacles for the Ducks. But with just one loss, in theory, they probably could afford another one as well. And I don't see them losing more than one game for the rest of the season. Number 6, I've got Georgia. I was high on Georgia coming into the season. I felt like as a whole they were the most complete team in the SEC. I've moved off of that a little bit. I think offensively they are not as balanced as I would like them to be. And defensively, they are a team that has had their struggles as well. But Kirby Smart's done an excellent job managing this group this year. It's not his most talented group, but he has put them in positions to win. And I look back to that Tennessee game earlier in the year where they got down to an offense that looked like it was firing on all cylinders, and they didn't lose their composure, which was important to note for games moving forward, because it proved already to not be the last time that they got down, and it might not be the last time they get down moving forward like they did against Tennessee. But Smart has them still believing in what they want to do, and I think they're one of the few programs that can get away with something like that. They're not, they've struggled with slow starts, but they have found ways to pull things together and win football games. So they're not out of it by any means until the clock strikes 0 in the fourth quarter, which I think gives them an opportunity to make their way back into the playoff this year. At number 5, I've got Indiana. At this point, the thought is that Indiana is the second best team in the Big Ten. I think that the schedule sets up for them very nicely to find their way to Indianapolis for the Big Ten title game, which should be an incredible atmosphere if they do get there. But where I see them still kind of having another rung to climb on the ladder is that game is probably going to be against Ohio State. And, at this point, I've said it a couple of times already in this episode that I think Ohio State is head and shoulders the best team in the country. And I don't, at this point, see anybody beating them in the regular season or in conference title week. So I've got to put Indiana somewhere because I do think that they're going to make the playoff. And I think they're going to make the Big Ten title game. But I can't put them any higher than this because the rest of the teams that I have ahead of them are the teams that I think are going to win the Power Four conferences. So with that being said, at number 4, I've got Texas Tech winning the Big 12. At number 3, I have Alabama winning the SEC. At number 2, I have Miami winning the ACC. And at number 1, I have Ohio State running the table and beating Indiana for the Big Ten title. So that's the re-rack. Where I was wrong, if we want to take a quick look back at my preseason top 12 ranking, it was pretty bad. Penn State at number 1. I don't have them there anymore. Clemson at number 4. I don't have them there anymore. Texas at number 6. I don't have them there anymore. Iowa State at number 7. They're not going to make it. Oklahoma at number 9. Maybe with the John Mateer injury not happening, I could still see that happening, but I don't have them in the playoff. Illinois at number 10. I mentioned them. I think they have a path, but given where I see some other teams falling at the end of the season, I don't have them in there. And then Boise State at number 12, which isn't going to happen this year. So what you're looking at is that half of the teams that I predicted would make the college football playoff before the season started. At this point, I do not have in my re-rack of those participants. Just outside the top 12, for a little bit of fodder for potential mailbag questions, I listed Ole Miss, Virginia, Illinois, and Cincinnati as my 4 teams left on the outside of the playoff this year. So give those a thought. Let me know what your thoughts are about the teams that did not get into my playoff. Do you see any of them definitely making it in? I know we've got Ole Miss right now ranked in the top 5. We've got Cincinnati kind of being that team that nobody really expected. You could say the same about Virginia. So there's a number of teams there that are some, kind of out there choices, but that's what you get in college football. It's already been a wild year. There's already been a lot of instances where I've been wrong, where other analysts have been wrong, and I expect that there's going to be a lot more opportunities to point fingers and tell us all that are sharing our thoughts how wrong we were as we work through the second half of the season. So hopefully you all enjoy what we've got in store. Another big weekend in college football coming up. Again, I'd like to invite you to utilize the mailbag, interact with us. That's what makes the show exciting for me. Hopefully it makes the show exciting for you too. cornversationspod@gmail.com, or leave a comment on one of our episode links. We can also be reached on all the socials that you peruse as well. Without further ado then, enjoy the weekend and hope to see you back for a future episode. Till next time, take it easy, Shuckers.